In the old days, before the cost caps came along, smaller Formula 1 teams had to do whatever they could to simply get by. And if they got their gambles wrong, they could end up losing a lot of money, or end up not existing at all. Minardi was an example of a team that was able to operate within its means and still survive for a long time, and they would often hire drivers who brought significant backing just to make sure they stayed on the grid. People who think that teams should get off the grid because they're not contributing would have had a heart attack if they ever saw Minardi, because aside from a front row start in the late 80s or early 90s, whenever it was at Phoenix either way, they were always at the back. When they scored points, they acted like they just won the championship. Other teams went for whatever sponsors were offering money. The story of Moneytron with the Onyx team springs to mind. Moneytron was the crypto scam of its day, with it supposedly being a machine that could predict market fluctuations and beat the capitalist system. The guy behind it, Jean-Pierre Van Rossum, made $800 million just for himself, and it later turned out that the whole thing was a fraud. Shocker! Although that said, the Onyx team he was sponsoring and later bought into did finish third at the 1989 Portuguese Grand Prix. But then Van Rossum ballsed everything up by announcing a deal with Porsche before he was supposed to, and the deal got cancelled. He then set fire to his own Porsche in protest. But there's a long list of teams that got ruined by scam companies or people that didn't have as much money as they let on. T-, another good example, the Rich Energy fiasco of 2019, and some other characters that have come in and out of the sport. Scams, frauds, criminal enterprises, they've all been involved. But at least they weren't using the teams to smuggle drugs into the country from the Netherlands. Vic Lee, looking in your direction. But there's another way of doing things, technical partnerships, and that might be how Sauber was able to survive in the period where the costs were going through the freaking roof. And speaking of money, the F1 store has got up to 70% off going on right now for the summer sales. I say this because Formula 1 gear is also expensive, and if you can save, even better. Yes, I get a kickback, but I'm doing this for you, not for me. In 1995 and 1996, Sauber had Ford engines in the back of the cars, inheriting the deal that Ford had done with Benetton. Basically what happened was Briatore used his connections to obtain Renault engines from Ligier to give to Benetton, and then Ford started supplying Sauber instead. And with those engines, Sauber were your typical 90s midfield team, scoring unremarkable low points finishes in 5th and 6th, and if the stars aligned just right, they'd get on the podium. Heinz-Harald Frentzen would get Sauber's first podium in 1995, and then in 1996 Sauber would get another podium when Johnny Herbert was one of the 3 cars to reach the finish line at Monaco. But in the background, things were changing slightly, because going into 1996, Sauber had a new look about them. Sauber, up until now, had been an independent works partner team, using Ilmor and Mercedes engines to start with, which carried on the relationship that Sauber and Mercedes had in Group C endurance, and then switched to Ford in 1995. As we've already mentioned. In 1996, Sauber unveiled a new colour scheme. The dark blue they'd been using in 1995 had now become much lighter, with the addition of a more sky blue or turquoise, teal, whatever you want to call it, added onto the side pods, because Sauber was now using fuels and lubricants from the Malaysian petrochemical company Petronas. So yeah, that happened. Red Bull and Petronas on the same car. Drive to Survive fans are now going to be in a state of visible confusion. The second year with Ford Power wasn't exactly great. In 1995, Sauber had scored 18 points and finished 7th in the Constructors. In 1996, the addition of Johnny Herbert should have improved things, as the vast majority of Sauber's points in 1995 had been scored by Frentzen. But in 1996, the team suffered from bad reliability or were involved in other people's accidents, and they scored fewer points despite having, on paper, a better lineup. They were still 7th in the standings, but considering that Pacific and Simtek had gone bust, Forti and Minardi weren't really going to be challenging, and Footwork and Tyrrell were also not much of a challenge, 11 points in 1996 was considered a failure. And during 1996, Sauber and Petronas started building a new facility in the team's hometown of Hinwil in Switzerland, because for 1997 they were going to be getting a new engine supplier. That supplier being Ferrari. Sort of. With the arrival of the Stewart team in 1997, Ford had got its priorities elsewhere. Stewart would get the supply of factory V10s because Stewart was, for all intents and purposes, the Ford factory team, and they would then supply inferior V8s to Lola, Tyrrell and Minardi. Sauber meanwhile did some hunting around and signed a customer engine supply deal with Ferrari. The agreement with Ferrari allowed Sauber access to the Tipo 046 engines that Ferrari had used during 1996, these being the first V10s that Ferrari had used in Formula 1. And as you may have seen from the video that I did on the Ferrari 310, it was an engine that wasn't exactly brilliant. The embarrassment of the French Grand Prix where Schumacher's engine blew up on the formation lap and he's listed as a non-starter. Irvine retired barely 5 laps in after not even setting a qualifying lap. The partnership with Petronas was going to help them here. Petronas was paying for the engines, and the facility built at Hinwil meant that Sauber and Petronas could work together on these engines and either improve what they'd already got or build brand new engines using the Ferrari blueprints. Or by reverse engineering the engine. However they did it, because it's not actually confirmed how they did it. Break it down, examine it, rebuild their own, and then slap a Petronas badge on it because, well, Petronas had paid for it. Sauber Petronas Engineering was the name of the facility. At the same time, the facility would be dedicated to the building of gearboxes to complement these rebadged Ferrari engines. Williams did a similar thing in the late 2000s and supplied their gearboxes to the back of the grid teams, Caterham, people like that. But it's actually quite interesting, because the facility doing this stuff to the Ferrari engines was initially set up because Sauber and Petronas wanted to team up and build their own engines. Tom Walkinshaw at Arrows had bought out Brian Hart's engine company to do the same thing, but Sauber and Petronas wanted to do it from scratch. So Arrows in 1998 and 1999 as well were the only team other than Ferrari to have their engines be made by the same people as the car. Petronas and Sauber were also doing some contracts because the Malaysian national car company in Proton was making use of engines that they built at this facility as well. The first engines were completed towards the end of the 1999 season and went into testing. And funnily enough, these prototypes had been completed just before the Malaysian Grand Prix, which was pretty good from Petronas' side. But the project went on indefinite hold not long after. In 1998 a market crash had occurred in Asia, and in the uncertainty surrounding the situation, Petronas and Sauber put the project on indefinite hold at the end of 1999. Would these engines have seen use during the 2000 season? Who even knows? And this is actually the first time I've heard about this project, and I'm adding this bit in after recording the rest of the video because, well, at least I think so, it warrants the extra information. That, and it will avoid the "you forgot" comments. Somebody once commented that I completely ignored some utterly obscure and mental fact involving an F1 teams and Phil Collins of all people. Yeah, sure. Ignored. I don't get it either. But it might explain why the Ferrari deal was always a one-year thing, just in case Sauber and Petronas wanted to revive the project. But they never did. They also had some help because they were able to bring in some Italian engineering brains for the project. The facility was staffed by former Ferrari engineers from both the Formula 1 and sports car divisions, and also some engineers from the former Alfa Romeo International Touring Car team. The ITC being this thing that shot off from DTM in the 90s when DTM went under for, well, the first time anyway. Also on the books was Osamu Goto, the man behind the Hondas that powered Ayrton Senna and Alain Prost to success, and had also been part of the design team that refined the Ferrari V12 through 1994 and 1995. Goto had also been part of the Tipo 046 design team, so to have the guy who designed the engine on their side was also a big help. It would be like buying Cosworth engines and then having Mike Costin on your books. The joke at the time was that Goto had put so much Honda DNA into those 1994 and 95 V12s and then into the 1996 V10 that he might as well have slapped a giant H on the engine cover instead of a prancing horse. There was another part of the deal, and that was Sauber would get access to Ferrari drivers. In 1997, Frentzen moved to Williams, although Frank had signed him at the end of 1995, meaning that Damon was out of the door as early as then rather than the midpoint of 1996. To replace Frentzen, Sauber called on Nicola Larini, the Ferrari test driver, who had scored a podium for Ferrari at the 1994 San Marino Grand Prix, even if there was no reason to celebrate that. Larini had got experience and had also been part of the Alfa team in Germany, so he was a safe pair of hands. But he didn't like the culture at Sauber and he quit after just 5 races. Another issue the team had was shoehorning the new Ferrari engine into the C15, which had been designed for a Ford engine until the switch happened. Sauber had to redesign the engine bay, gearbox and suspension at short notice because that's how late Ford had dumped them to focus exclusively on Stewart. Now, reading up on things, it looks like the car was designed for a V8, similar to what Lola, Minardi and Tyrrell were going to be using, but from what I can gather, it looks like Ford weren't going to supply Sauber either due to Sauber wanting a good V8 or that Ford wasn't going to supply a team that could be considered a rival. The additional 2 cylinders naturally made the engine longer, which wasn't ideal, and the car ended up being a longer wheelbase than originally intended. But it actually helped them a bit. They could put all the suspension elements into one single place and it reduced the amount of bodywork. So drag was reduced, aero efficiency went up, and the diffuser worked better. So win 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 win. Although the whole thing had sort of backfired on them when they took it to the first test, and when it came back in after a test run, they found scorch marks all over the engine cowling. Oops. But the car started off somewhat competitive in 1997. Larini scored his last F1 point in Australia, while Herbert was involved in the Turn 1 melee with Irvine and Villeneuve. Herbert would then be 7th in Brazil, but then got 4th in Argentina, with more points finishes at Spain, Canada, a podium at Hungary, 4th at Belgium, and 6th in Japan. After Larini's resignation, Gianni Morbidelli and Norberto Fontana shared the second seat, but this new relationship with Ferrari did court controversy later on that season. A case of champagne from Ferrari to Sauber there, because Argentinian newcomer Norberto Fontana, up from Formula 3, really helped Michael Schumacher on his way there. Yeah, it's a terrible impression, but I'm going to work with it. What engine have they got in that Sauber, Murray? Isn't it a Ferrari? Well, it is, yes. Martin, you are a cynical chap. There's actually conflicting reports for this. Fontana claimed that Jean Todt had threatened to pull the engine supply if Sauber didn't help Schumacher out in that finale in Jerez, while Peter Sauber said in 2006 that the myth is exactly that, a myth, and that Ferrari had not once asked in the 9 years that they've been partners that they should do those kinds of tricks. But it's one of those things that will always be debated, and I really want to watch that race again to see if it's as epic now as it was at the time. So 1997 was really a sightseeing year just to see where they sat with this new Ferrari engine and take the experience of 1997 into 1998. Ferrari renewed the contract and Sauber got the engines back for 1998 so they could push forward and see where they could get to from the position they'd achieved in 1997. But even with Ferrari engines, Sauber was still locked in that mid-grid position. They were one of those teams that should have been able to make that final jump into the top part of the grid, but never made it. With Williams and Benetton slipping away, there was a chance that Sauber could make it forward, but they just couldn't. Between Alesi and Herbert, the car would finish outside the points in 7th, 5 times, but Alesi would score Sauber's 4th podium in as many seasons with 3rd at the utterly mental Belgian Grand Prix. Herbert, meanwhile, who scored his only point of the year in Australia, had become so disillusioned with the bad luck and lack of progress, he decided to move to Stewart for 1999. Johnny would win a race in 1999 and Stewart would finish 4th in the Constructors, while Sauber effectively stayed where they were in that 6th place bubble. So it sounds like a lack of ambition or they were simply not spending their money wisely enough, but being stuck in that little bubble and remaining in that bubble actually ended up helping Sauber in the long term, because when the 2000s kicked in, it was going to kick off in a big way when it came to spending. The debate around Mercedes beryllium pistons kicked everything off, at least in my opinion it did. Because after this, Mercedes, Ferrari, Honda, Renault and BMW all increased spending to find the next wonder material for use in engines, with Ferrari going down the ceramics route. Carbon fibre gearboxes also got tested among other things, and with BMW hooking up with Williams, Renault coming back, Toyota joining and Honda increasing stock in BAR, as well as Mercedes being shareholders in McLaren and Ferrari being Ferrari, the smaller guy was going to be left on his own. Prost was the first to fall at the end of 2001. Arrows died mid-2002 and it left just Sauber, Minardi and Jordan as the 3 independents, although Sauber did have an advantage over the other 2 teams because they had a lot of outside investment through shareholders. At the same time, Sauber could take advantage of their engine deal with Ferrari. The Ferrari engine was one of the best engines on the grid. Not best in terms of overall power because BMW had got them beaten and Mercedes recovered after the BEAL ban, but the Ferrari engine was certainly the more reliable of those 3. If you go onto Stats F1 and look at Ferrari engine failures between 2000 and 2005, there aren't that many, at least compared to the BMW and Mercedes offerings. Sauber took further advantage when they started licensing every conceivable part that they could from Ferrari. They were essentially the Haas of the time. Why design and build your own parts at cost when you can have Ferrari send you the blueprints and cut out the R&D middleman? Money saved. And since Sauber were licensing from the dominant team on the grid, and Ferrari by 2004 would have had the most dominant run in the sport's history, that is until Mercedes came along and knocked that streak for 6, they were getting the best parts on the grid. And since those parts were designed to work with Ferrari's overall design of the car, it meant that Sauber could, in effect, build knockoff Ferraris, a bit like the Tracing Point from 2020. They would run, effectively, the previous year's Ferrari, much like the 2007 Super Aguri was the 2006 Honda, and the 1996 Ligier was the 1995 Benetton. And since the Ferraris were so good, the Saubers could remain in the mid-pack. Aside from the 2000 season where they slipped back due to a colossal amount of retirements, they remained in that mid-grid bubble. They were 8th in 2000, 4th in 2001, 5th in 2002, 6th in 2003 and 2004, but then slipped back to 8th again in 2005. And Sauber also managed to do some wheeling and dealing to stay afloat. I've already mentioned the shareholders, but when Herbert left at the end of 1998, it freed up some salary. So they brought in Pedro Diniz with his Brazilian Tesco money, and it brought in a significant amount of budget. Okay, the performances through 1999 and 2000 weren't the best, and the switch to Bridgestone tyres might also not have helped, but it was a cash injection either way. Then there was the 2001 season. Raikkonen appeared, and Peter Sauber was called crazy for taking the kid on, and even the FIA was a bit concerned by his lack of experience. But Kimi's performance during 2001 led to Ron Dennis over at McLaren paying a stupid amount of money to secure the services of Raikkonen for 2002. More money in Peter Sauber's back pocket. So a technical partnership with the dominant team, building knockoffs of the previous year's Ferrari, which did actually get them in trouble one year when other teams thought they'd copied it a bit too well, and managing to find some decent sponsorships and operating well within their means, it meant that Sauber could stay alive. Okay, they never reached any lofty heights, with the best performance of 4th in 2001 being the best they could do, but they stayed in the middle, staying alive. While Eddie Jordan's outfit slid further and further and further back, and Paul Stannard's Minardi also clung on for dear life. The safety net from the technical partnership with Ferrari and the resulting savings allowed for Sauber to bring in some half-decent drivers, instead of those who were just bringing money and, well, not a lot else. I've already mentioned Raikkonen, who would have been hired on the cheap anyway because he was a rookie and didn't have that much experience, and it would have also been easier to get rid of him if he flopped, but Heidfeld, Frentzen, Massa, Fisichella and Villeneuve would all pass through the door, with Villeneuve, the 1997 world champion, being the only one who could command a big salary. And with BMW buying the team for the 2006 season, it meant that the team was secured even more long term. Sauber's partnership with Ferrari was renewed every single year, with the exception of the BMW years obviously, but when BMW pulled out at the end of 2009, Sauber went straight back to using Ferrari engines, and that relationship has continued ever since. The exception will be at the end of this year, when the Sauber name will disappear for good as the team is set to become Audi. And with Sauber having a bit of a mini recovery in the mid part of the 2025 season, things are looking alright for Audi for when they come in, but the DNA of the team will continue, even if the name will be gone. So it does make you wonder then, what if it hadn't been Sauber that hooked up with Ferrari in the late 90s? What if Jordan had done it instead of going with Honda and then getting shafted by Honda? Would it be Sauber that went backwards and went bust instead and Jordan stayed alive? Answers on a postcard, I guess. So then, a look at the Sauber and Ferrari partnership. Not necessarily a success story in terms of results, but staying alive in that part of the 2000s where the manufacturers went on a spending spree is definitely a success, because, well, all the other privateers folded in that time period. If this has been interesting for you, then do give the video a like so I know a good job was done, and for more fun looks through the motorsport history books, do get subscribed and also get that bell on so you never miss out on any future videos. Massive thanks as ever go out to the rad lads at Patreon who support me at a more personal level, and if you want to help keep the lights on around here or help with any picture purchases, then there's a link to Patreon in the description, along with links to Discord, socials, affiliates and other bits and bobs you might want or need to know. Or there's super thanks for one and done donations and memberships so you can Patreon without the Patreon. So until next time, I've been Aidan Millward, have a great day wherever you are, and goodbye.